Hi, everybody. My name is Nanika Edwards. I'm a poet and author from Trinidad and Tobago in the Caribbean. And in this video, I'm putting on my philosopher hat as we continue the topic of critical thinking. And finally, we get to David. Video number 4, How David Thought. So I hope that you did your homework. If you haven't, I would encourage you to pause the video and take a quick hop and a leap on over to 1 Samuel 17 in the Bible and read the entire account of David and Goliath. That story is so dense. And by the way, I've heard at least one person say, I believe it was a pastor or some type of church teacher, say that the account of David and Goliath is the most detailed account of a military conflict in the Bible. Like the most detailed story with respect to an actual military conflict. And by the way, it's an epic story. And we all love it because, of course, it's all about an underdog or a seeming underdog overcoming a much bigger, much stronger rival, at least to all appearances. And by the way, I would also encourage you to check out some videos on YouTube or check out some articles online about the account of David and Goliath because it's a very dense story in terms of meaning and symbolism and the lessons that are woven into the story. And I can tell you that I watched probably about, I don't know, maybe about 10 different videos on David and Goliath in English and Spanish. And I also read the account myself several times over. And I can tell you with respect to especially for example, with respect to the videos that I saw, every video had a unique perspective on the story that was credible. So it's a very dense story. You can pull so much out of it. But anyway, I would encourage you, go hop on over to 1 Samuel 17 and read the account of David and Goliath. You can check out the Bible website, Bible Gateway. You can pull up a Bible and pull up 1 Samuel 17. Or if you would like, you could download a Bible to your phone, for example, YouVersion or CBN Bible. C as in Cinderella, B as in Butterfly, N as in Network, CBN Bible, which also includes Strong's Concordance, like if you're interested in studying the original Hebrew or Greek, which I would always recommend, then, you can just quickly just do your homework and then come back and hit play and continue the video. Okay, so now that we're all on the same page and we've all read the account of David and Goliath, let me just pull out a couple things about how David thought, because David was a real critical thinker. And by the way, David is a really interesting person. The Bible tells us that God said that David was a man after his own heart. In fact, what God was saying was, this is the kind of person I've always wanted to see walking planet Earth, right? And just remember, David was, in a lot of ways, a typical guy like anybody else. But he was extraordinary because he made extraordinary choices. Life is about choices. And a lot of times we take the path of least resistance. David was not that kind of guy. So if you want to be extraordinary like David, then make extraordinary choices. Anyway, let's dive into how David thought because it will help us sharpen our critical thinking skills, or at least teach us what critical thinking can look like. Now, critical thinking has many different pillars. In this video, we're going to learn about 12 of them. You can see them all here listed in these blocks, but there are many other pillars. I mean, I've come up with probably about, I don't know, 20 plus pillars that I can think of related to critical thinking. And so, like I've told you, critical thinking is a huge topic. And we could dive deep into each pillar and talk on and on and on. But anyway, I know you don't want me talking on and on about critical thinking. You want me to talk about David. So let's get to David. First of all, one of the pillars, and by the way, in this video, we're going to be looking at the general pillars of critical thinking. And we're talking across time, across ages, across cultures. These are some of the key pillars of critical thinking. So, and when we say pillars, what do I mean? These are the things that can hold your thinking up, that can allow your thinking to stand up to scrutiny, right? These are pillars of critical thinking. By the way, if you hear any car engines in the background, I do believe that people are drag racing in the area. Hopefully the video is not going to pick that up. Hopefully the audio, is not going to pick that up. Anyway, one of the first things we see about David is he's very observant. So David goes to take some food for his brothers in the camp, and he's noticing different things. I'm sure he noticed how his brothers were doing. I mean, probably without them even telling him, although he asked after them to see if they were okay and so on. We can read between the lines and see that that's what happened. Then he noticed what was happening between the two armies, the Philistines and the Israelites. He realized that the men of Israel were petrified of Goliath. He noticed that Goliath was very disrespectful, that he was arrogant, and all of those different things. David was observant, and I'm sure he noticed many other things, but he was observant. And I know you would say, well, those are obvious. Yeah, I know, but David was the kind of person who could pick up on people very easily. How else was David observant? In this scenario, I think the most important thing that David observed was Goliath's Achilles heel, which was not in his foot, but in his forehead. Goliath's Achilles heel was his forehead. And I mean, there's all kind of meaning, I guess, that you could connect to that, right? Okay, but yeah, his weak spot or his soft spot was his forehead, and I think that it's interesting that if we're looking at it scientifically, that portion of the brain is significant to thinking, significant to our thought life and how we think. Anyway, so David was very observant. Another pillar of critical thinking is inference or interpretation. They're kind of the same, or at least very similar. So, for example, when Eliab was giving David a hard time, he realized that he was giving him a hard time. People looking on may have thought, okay, it's just a regular sibling interaction, but David understood that Eliab was being hostile. That's why he said, is there not a cause? Kind of like, what have I done now? Isn't there a good reason for me to be asking these questions? So David was very good at inferring things and interpreting things. And so, for example, with respect to Eliab, he was able to infer from what Eliab said what he was actually feeling, which is actually envy. But that's another story for another day. Did you see anything else in this passage that David inferred? Okay, analysis or appraisal is another pillar. I mentioned it in the last video when I spoke about poetry. and the connection between poetry and building critical thinking skills. Isn't it interesting, by the way? This is just an aside, and I'm only just thinking of this, that David was a poet. David was a great critical thinker. He was a person who wrote most of the Psalms. And without the music, the Psalms are really poems, but they're really songs, right? But without the music, they're poems. So David was a poet, he was a thinker. And his exposure to poetry was one of the things that I think, coming to think about it, must have made him a really sharp thinker. So, analysis and accurate analysis is really important to critical thinking. So, we see David's analytical skills in this passage in 1 Samuel 17. We see how he appraised Goliath, for example. He was the only person close to the battle who recognized that Goliath was not really a giant. Everybody else saw him as a giant. Can you hear my pet lizard? It's not a pet lizard, but we have lizards that run around the house and they make these interesting noises. They don't really bother me, but anyway, yeah. I don't know if you just heard that lizard, but anyway, yeah. So David appraised Goliath accurately, and the end of the story, emphatically proved that he was right. You know, Goliath was really, at least in the spiritual realm, he was a dwarf. So David was very analytical. He understood that the key issue was not that the Philistine was mocking the Israelite army. The key issue was that the Philistine was defying God. That was really the core issue for David. And that was the core issue for God. So David appraised the situation and he appraised Goliath accurately. Another pillar of critical thinking is asking good questions. And kids are really good at this. Kids typically ask really good questions that tend to end with why. Like they'll ask a string of questions, and the very last question most likely be why. So David asked good questions. He wanted to know, first of all, what the reward would be for slaying the quote unquote giant. By the way, as I've heard some commentators say and note, that passage, 1 Samuel 17, never referred to Goliath as a giant, but we do. If you check the original Hebrew, I don't think the word giant is used. Champion, but not giant. Anyway, asking good questions is one of the pillars of critical thinking, and David asked good questions. And he, for example, asked questions about the reward that would be offered for slaying the quote unquote giant. And I'm pretty sure that David probably prayed somehow, probably in his head, in his heart, and said, God, how do I tackle this giant? Right? I'm pretty sure he addressed a question or a couple questions to his good shepherd. Are you hearing the drag racing? Okay, I'm just going to have to record with it, I'm afraid, but why people would be drag racing at 20 to 4 in the morning, I'm not sure. Okay, so another pillar of critical thinking is info gathering. Info gathering. David gathered information. For example, he asked a question to get information. What will be the reward? Right? He gathered info. Also, connected to gathering info and intel, in this case, somehow David seemed to know about Goliath. Goliath didn't know about David, but David knew about Goliath because when he went to the stream to get the stones, he picked up 5 stones. And it is widely believed, it's generally believed, that David picked up 5 stones because he knew that Goliath had 4 other brothers. So he got four other stones apart from the stone for Goliath, just in case he needed to defend himself against the four brothers when he got rid of Goliath. And isn't it interesting that he didn't get, say, for example, 10 stones or 6 stones, a couple extra stones just in case he missed? He knew that he was always going to be on target, right? So that's very interesting. Anyway, he gathered info and he gathered intel. The other thing that David did, which is a pillar of critical thinking, is that he fact checked. So, for example, when he asked what the reward would be for slaying for slaying Goliath, one person told him, "Well, you get this, you get that, you get the other. You get the princess, you get the king, the hand of the king's daughter in marriage, you get exemption from taxes, etc., etc." But just to be sure, he asked somebody else. So he fact checked. He didn't just take he didn't just accept what the first person told him, he fact checked. And by the way, one of the areas where I think fact checking is very important, and I'm going to put in a plug here, is with slander and gossip. People are often very quick to believe slander and gossip, and I know because I've been the target of slander and gossip. And very rarely have people come to me, almost never, to verify any facts. People would simply swallow wholesale what somebody whispers in their ear because it's juicy, it's tasty, it's yummy, it's entertaining, but it's important to fact check. So I just want to put in a plug there. David also had a high degree of emotional intelligence, and I think we can even see that in the Psalms. His level of um, connection to himself and his emotions, his willingness to express himself, to cry even as a military man. He was a man who was, not afraid to cry, not afraid to express his emotions, was very transparent with God and so on. So he had a high level of emotional intelligence, which is one of the key pillars of critical thinking, emotional intelligence. In this story, for example, we see this in how he interacted with Saul, the king at the time. And, the way that he spoke to him, the language that he used, he clearly had a sense of protocol. He had a sense of how to carry himself and so on. He had a high degree of emotional intelligence. So, with respect to critical thinking, it's not just purely about intellect, it's also about emotional intellect. So, not just mental, cerebral intellect, like factual intellect, but also emotional intellect, emotional intelligence. So, David knew how to speak to the king, he knew how to carry himself, and he knew how to speak. All of these things are connected to emotional intelligence. Um, David also had a healthy skepticism about, some things. So this again is a pillar of critical thinking. So, for example, when Saul suggested that David use Saul's armor, David first tested it. Yeah, it's a king. Maybe, typically I should, just do what the king tells me to do, but he may be the king, but he's still a man. He may be the king, but he's still a man. So David tested what Saul told him and he tried out the armor and he realized, you know what, this is not going to work. So David had healthy skepticism. He knew that a, a pinch of doubt or a good dose of doubt sometimes is helpful. Of course, if you question everything, you doubt everything, that is not healthy skepticism. Like a lot of people think that if they question everything, they doubt everything, that somehow it makes them look or sound intelligent. But you're supposed to be, we're supposed to be discerning enough to know what to question and what to doubt. It's very silly to doubt and question everything. Okay, David was a problem solver, and that's another pillar of critical thinking. One of the key reasons that we need critical thinking is to solve problems because life is full of problems, big problems and little problems. And so David realized when he went to take the provisions for his brothers that there was a problem. There was a giant problem called Goliath. Well, giant problem to the army, but not a giant problem to David or to God. So David was a problem solver. He solved the problem. He got rid of Goliath. So he was a problem solver. Another pillar of critical thinking is creativity. And David was very creative. I mean, you're coming up against a man of war who's practically armored from head to toe in bronze. He's a huge brute, you know, he's a beast of a man, right? And you go against him, as Goliath said, with sticks. That's how it looked to Goliath. But David was very creative. And you know, one of the things to note is that David didn't say, well, the way I dealt with the bears and the lions, I go deal so with he. That's how I'll deal with him. No, he came up with another strategy, and I want to believe it's what God put in his heart because David was very in tune with God. So he decided, I'm going to use a sling, right? I'm going to use a sling. So, so David was very creative because he realized he probably wouldn't have been able to contend with Goliath in hand to hand combat when he was armored from head to toe with metal, you know, with pure metal. So he chose to use his sling and it worked perfectly. Okay, so creativity was one of David's strong suits. Makes sense. He was a poet, he was a musician, and the creativity required to be a skillful poet, a skillful musician, overflowed into his military prowess. David was a communicator, and communication is another pillar of critical thinking. David knew how to communicate, as I mentioned before, and again, he was a poet, so that was a huge boon from God in his favor. He knew how to talk. You listen to what he said to Goliath. Goliath, I don't know if you noticed in the passage, but David said a lot more than Goliath. And so he was a communicator. He knew how to talk, right? He knew how to talk, and he knew how to talk to fit the occasion. So he could speak to Saul in one way, but when he's dealing with a bad John, a gangster like Goliath, he also knew how to talk. So he was a communicator, which makes sense because he was a poet, right? So David understood the power of communication. And finally, the final pillar, but like I said, there are many other pillars to critical thinking. This is just 12 of them here. David was an abstract thinker. So abstract thinking is one of the pillars of critical thinking. David was able to see a clear parallel between the bears and lions that God empowered him to rip apart and Goliath. For example, when a bear wants to be intimidating, let's say you attack a bear and it wants to appear more intimidating, what will it do? Right, it will stand on its hind legs and then it looks like a giant. So a bear, quite literally, to David, could have looked like a giant. Remember, I mean, when David confronted Goliath, he was probably in his mid-teens, like somewhere between I think 14 and 16 years old is what I've read online. I think he was between 14 and 16, somewhere around there. His mid-teens possibly. So for somebody that age dealing with a bear or lion, especially a bear, let's say, a bear would look like a giant. So David immediately made the connection between the bear and Goliath. And then what about a lion? Well, I've heard that lions are so strong that even if you shoot at them, let's say you shoot them in the side, in the rib or something, they won't feel the bullet. It won't penetrate. I guess depending on what type of weapon you're using, what type of hunting gear you're using, but you know, to me that kind of equates to Goliath's armor, you know, to some extent. So David saw a clear correlation between the bears and lions that he was accustomed to ripping apart by the divine enablement of God, and Goliath. So David was an abstract thinker. He was able to connect seemingly disconnected things and use them to his advantage. So David was an abstract thinker, and we see that very clearly in 1 Samuel 17. So David had mastered, by the time he was in his mid teens, many of the pillars of critical thinking. And if you read 1 Samuel 17, you will see that these may be some of the very reasons why he was chosen to be Israel's future king and one of the main type in the Bible of Christ in the Old Testament. So, again, the pillars of critical thinking that were highlighted in this video include observation, interpretation or inference, analysis or appraisal, asking good questions, info gathering, fact checking, emotional intelligence or EQ. In this case, we see that David exemplified this in his sensitivity to protocol. Another pillar of critical thinking is healthy skepticism. We could also add problem solving, creativity, which is important for problem solving, communication, and abstract thinking. And I'd like to think that some people who may end up watching this video may be entrepreneurs. And where does entrepreneurship start? With solving a problem. How do we solve people's problems? Using our creativity. These are skills that can be developed. So I hope that this was interesting for you. In our next video, video number 5, we're going to look at Goliath. And you could probably already start thinking about how Goliath thought and the lessons that we can learn from Goliath. Because when we study people, and a lot of the Bible is about studying people, we can learn like that. You remember that show? I don't know if it still runs, but you know, what to wear and what not to wear. You know, David was clothed with the righteousness of God, but Goliath was not, quite the opposite. He was clothed with armor, but not with the righteousness of God. And because of that, he thought in a particular way. So we're going to look at that in our next video, video number 5. If you enjoyed this, thank you for giving it a thumbs up. And if you would like to see other videos like it, please subscribe. Until next time.